Okay, so thank you so much, Tony, for joining us here on the Arctic Indigenous Investment Series. So I am Blair Hogan, the president of the Yukon First Nation Chamber of Commerce, and we're doing a series on Indigenous economic development, Indigenous business development, and just really kind of diving deep into Indigenous business issues that kind of come from the Yukon, in some cases from the Yukon First Nation final agreements, Chapter 22, and we're seeking people like yourself who have either been involved in the First Nation final agreements or in the cultivation of Chapter 22 or any of the entities that kind of come from or circulate around Chapter 22 or any of the final agreement bodies that start to kind of support or are part of Indigenous economic development. So it would be great to get a better sense of who you are, and maybe I can start that, that you were the premier of the Yukon, the NDP government that was in power when the final agreements were initially signed. And you were part of that whole process of not only the final agreements, but of devolution. Right. And so you've been front and center, at least from a Yukon government perspective, in how does First Nations, how does Yukon and First Nations govern themselves? And how do we do that in a self-sufficient way, in a sovereign way? And a huge part of that, and I know there's so much, and I don't want to overload you on that, but there's so much that goes into that. But a big part of that is economic development, self-sufficiency, and the ability to participate in whatever economy that we grow together. Right. So, and there's so much more to your introduction, but maybe we'll start there.
Okay. First of all, I should say that I didn't spend my childhood here. My parents were mobile. My father was the only doctor in Dawson City when I came back from university.
Does that mean there were also the dentist and also all those?
Well,
things?
no, there was a visiting dentist, but that's an interesting thing. There was a federal program back in those days. Whitehorse had dentists, but the small communities didn't. Federal program which had these, I can't remember what they're called, dental therapists, dental assistants, largely Indigenous women, including from the Yukon, who would actually go into communities and do dental hygiene and very basic dental work for kids, because a lot of the kids were coming to school in the regular school system with dental caries and teeth problems with teeth. Which had never been addressed because there hadn't been a dentist in their small communities. Unless they'd come to Whitehorse and seen a dentist here, they might not have known they even had a difficulty. And the irony was we had, in those days, I recall people coming up from Skagway, Alaska, to go to dentists in Whitehorse. But in fact, young people in many rural communities in the Yukon didn't have access to a dentist. There were these dental therapists. I can't remember what the exact job description was, but they were largely Indigenous women, and it was a federal program that worked in the NWT. It worked in northern Manitoba, northern Saskatchewan, northern Alberta, northern BC too, I think, for Indigenous communities. So it was actually created for them. Yeah.
And then also a bit of veterinary work too, I imagine, just being in a small community, and being a man of so many skills.
I haven't thought about it, but I'm sure there was some of that.
Right.
And there were doctors also in Whitehorse who've been here for a long time. I remember Dr. Buchan and some others. There was a doctor in Mayo who'd been there a very long time. But I think in Dawson City, where my father was practicing, there were a lot of high turnover doctors. In fact, to get a doctor there, my father was at some stage in his career at whatever university he was at the time, saw an ad in the Globe and Mail. They were looking for a doctor. And we didn't really have Medicare then. This is pre-implementation of Medicare in the Yukon. And the city of Dawson was desperate enough to have a doctor. They were offering a free house for a doctor.
Oh, wow.
But then the other half of that equation, to make it a viable practice, Clinton Creek, which was the mining town, 60 kilometers away, 60 miles, which it was also willing to pay the doctor to come for 3 days a week to come to Clinton Creek and do the mandatory medicals, which in an asbestos mine, of course, are absolutely necessary.
Was that asbestos mine one of the bigger asbestos mines in Canada? Or
it probably wasn't as big as the same company. I was operated at Cassiar, BC, which was also a slightly different grade of asbestos, but it had a longer life.
Okay.
And this is an economic story we can come back to, Blair, which is interesting, of course, because Clinton Creek was opened with great fanfare, with Pierre Trudeau coming and announcing this was a 25-year development agreement, and this was going to be a mine that would last for 25 years, and the community was going to be built, and there were people had lives and careers there. But of course, there was a contradictory thing in federal policy, which was a tax-free period for mining companies, which was federal finance, and allowed them to basically high-grade the ore body in the first 3 or 4 years without paying any taxes.
Right.
And so we ended up with a 7-year mine, not a 25-year mine, and a school, which the territorial government had paid for, was, I think, auctioned off for $7,000
Okay.
when the mine closed.
Wow. Taxpayer funded.
Yep, taxpayer funded. So there were all sorts of anomalies like that at the time, and you mentioned this problem of, well, I mentioned the problem of high grading, but it's a problem all the way, not just in the northern Canada, but it was a problem everywhere in the world. Mining companies coming in, rip and roar, take out the ore, get out of there and move on. The model that is increasingly favored by not only environmental interests, but communities, is that you try and create a mine which will actually have a longer life. A long enough life that you can build a community around it. You train local people to actually work in the mine. You don't just bring in, as Clinton Creek did, 90% of the employees were from down south. I think when I worked there were 2 First Nation people who worked at the mine. One was the guy who had discovered the asbestos, who was on his trap line, Art Anderson. He was given a job for life. I don't know whether he was ever paid for actually being the discoverer of the ore body, but he was certainly given a job for life. And there was one of the Henry, Percy Henry's family who worked there on a day shift job, which there were a number of jobs which are just day shift jobs, which are surface laborers, things like that. But I remember one of the things I talked to the young First Nation people, they hated about mining companies was shift work. Totally disrupted family life and community life. You couldn't participate in potlatches. You couldn't participate in weddings and funerals. The mine was only 60 miles away, but to actually have to only get a few days off, which might not be the natural weekend. You might get 2 days off and you have to get in your vehicle and go back 60 miles to Dawson City, was very disruptive for people. And shift work, I mean, you can argue that it's necessary for the operating of mines, but I'm not absolutely certain, and we may want to talk about this further, but a model I'm much attracted to is something called the small mill model, which is instead of allowing Clinton Creek to build a big mill that they could actually grind out all the entire ore body in a relatively short period of time, you buy, as Voisey's Bay has done in Newfoundland, they've done an agreement where it says you will build a small mill, you will operate the mine, take out the ore body at a measured pace, with the idea that you might become a 25-year or 50-year or even 100-year community, which is very common in Scandinavia. And you say that we want you to hire local people and train local people and make jobs for people here who will actually put down roots and build a community, build a family. You will put a school, you will have all the facilities. It's a very different model of mining, and I think a much healthier one. Because everywhere you go in the Arctic North, near north or far north, you will find dead mines. In fact, I wrote an essay back when I was first running for the legislature in 1970 about how there were more ghost towns in the Yukon than there were mines. In other words, mines had come and gone, and with no permanent benefit for... Now, the gold mine in the Yukon and Dawson City were somewhat different because, as you know, you went from individual prospectors digging the bit of ground to, in fact, big dredges that would which dredging up the river bottom horribly environmentally in terms of the consequences to actually maximize the ore body, so the big companies in New York were actually profiting from these. Now, of course, there's still gold mining going on in Dawson City, but it's not on the same scale it was during the Klondike Gold Rush. But another story I remember, because of course El Sequino, that was a silver mining area, operated for a long time, and after gold went down in Dawson City, silver mining went up. That sort of filled the gap in the big mining picture in the Yukon. And when United Keno Hill Mines was shut or sold, I don't remember what the sequence was, it got bought by Falconbridge. Now, that was a long-term community. There were people who were born and raised there, including the president of the local steelworkers union. It was a family had been there 40 years. And there was an interesting class structure there, too, where the management were mostly Germans and the hourly wage workers were largely Slavs, often from Yugoslavia and other Slavic places in Eastern Europe. And they've been there a long time. And what was interesting was that when it was sold and the mine was shut, they decided there wasn't enough valuable ore there left. There were a couple of efforts to find other companies came in, but Falconbridge bought it up. Falconbridge, multinational, has mines all over the place. And remember this contrast. When Clifford Frame was president, chairman of the board of Curragh Resources running Faro, he had this big palatial corporate office in Toronto. When I went to visit the president of Falconbridge, who had just closed the United Keno Hill, I was going to see him because he had given those people who had been there for 40 years a matter of days to get out of town.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like we'll circle back to your introduction and some of that stuff, but you've kind of taken us to a heart of some of the conversation we're to have, and it's about how has mining been done in the past? What are some of the issues? How is it still being done to a large degree?
Right.
It's very similarly, but you've alluded to a few things that there's potentially better ways of doing it.
Yeah.
That in many cases we have abandoned assets, abandoned towns, ghost towns, all these things that you need to build around a mine, whether it's renewable or energy generation or renewable energy generation, whether it's the mill and the centers of technical knowledge creation, the education, the communities that you need to build, the infrastructure, the highways, all of this. It's hard to justify that level of investment, that scale of investment for such a short horizon of economic opportunity, especially when the mining legislation, the royalty regime, all of these things are done in such a way to incentivize so much investment, but it's not done in a way that creates meaningful legacies for the Yukon.
Yeah, and we're always under pressure because mining industry is powerful. Often the chambers of commerce in the cities like Whitehorse are very keen to create the jobs, as we were when we came to power in 1985 in the middle of a very deep recession, where all of our mines were shut.
Right.
And the economy was really in trouble. We had this other huge issue for us, which was to get land claims settled. And I never said this in quite these plain language, but I'll tell you now, my thought very clearly was this. To say in not kind of plain English as I can now, to say to the non-Indigenous community who desperately wanted jobs, you want jobs, we're going to have to settle land claims. And to say to Indigenous people who wanted land claims, you're going to have to actually, we know you're concerned about mining, you may not like mining, you may see you don't have any benefits from it, but I need to get mines open and people working in order to get land claim settlement.
Right.
Because if we create hostility between these two communities, and there had been lots of misunderstandings, we can't actually do what we need to do to grow. Mm-hmm. And you may remember, we'll come back to this, but I began a process after we got that initial Faro open and some other things going, bought the NCPC, the power company. We began this Yukon 2000 process, which was a process of getting everybody, community by community, but also territorial-wide, discussions which were actually built on what we agree on, not what we disagree about.
Right. and you're taking us to another heart of conversation too, which is right now we're talking about in the Yukon, the Yukon Connector Grid project.
Yeah.
And I'm hearing some of the same things that you're saying that was happening back then when it came to do we or do we not do land claims? Will this enable mining? How do we create jobs? The exact same conversation and all those same points for and against are happening right now with the Connector Grid project.
Yeah.
You have Indigenous communities saying, we don't want in the news just today. We don't want mining because of how it's going to open up mines. And you have the other side saying, well, we need the connector grid so that not only can we build more effectively mines and be able to energize them, but we need a more stable grid. We need the ability to, $7.6 billion annually in new economic activity. There's a certain quantum of jobs that is now going to be allowable. So in many ways, we're still having the same types of conversations, and it's still the same points of for and against when it comes to mega projects like the Yukon Grid Connect and how it relates to land claims, environmentalism, Indigenous rights, and so forth.
Well, we can come back to this, but let me just mention this as connectors to what you're saying. If we'd known that Faro was only going to go up, got it open in 1885, and then not very long after it was actually going to be shut because, as it turns out, it was the federal government that forced Clifford Frame to go and build the West Tree mine, where 26 miners got killed, which caused the whole Coeur Resources empire to collapse. We would never have spent the money to build the road to Skagway, which we built the road because the railway company was then saying to Coeur, essentially, we want jack up freight rates so high that we become the main profit taker from this mine.
Right.
And the company said, we can't afford to pay those freight rates, and the government agreed. So we did something that nobody had ever done. We made the road to Skagway an all-weather road. Not cheap. And then the governor of Alaska comes in and says, oh, by the way, we're going to have a very high standard of paved highway once we cross the Alaska border into Skagway. Mm-hmm. Everybody piles on, right? It becomes difficult. The opposite result, which I'm going to come back to, is the question of Voisey's Bay, which I will come back to in great length. But the consequence there is they've got a 70% Indigenous hire at the mine.
And sorry, where is that?
This is in Newfoundland.
Okay.
So this is the small mill model.
Okay.
You take another case where you have a Canadian-owned mine in Alaska, which has an Inuit workforce of 700 people, which is on their land claims land, which is why they're able to bargain for that. And they do get to shut the mine if the water quality ever falls below a certain level until it's fixed up. But I mean, they asked me to go to a meeting not so long ago. And one of the questions I asked, I said, okay, so you've been there 30 years in this arrangement, whatever it was. How many Inuit are in management? 0. Mm-hmm. I contrast that. I'm just going all over the map, but we can come back to these things. When we were doing the Mount Skookum mine, which is not that far from Faro, up the same area, gold mine, we were trying to do development benefit agreements with First Nations. And I remember, and I can tell you this because even though Ralph Sultan, who was the vice chair of Coeur, was doing the negotiations with us, me principally, about the benefits agreements, they agreed to everything right away. The community wanted this, and they wanted that, and they wanted this other thing, and jobs and training, and blah, blah. Yes, sure. Come back 1 year later to talk about compliance, and they barely met 50% of the agreements. And I remember saying to Ralph Sultan, who was a smart guy, this is a Harvard Business School professor, who'd gone on to become a senior person at the Royal Bank, vice chair. And, he born and raised in BC, but he'd come back. And I remember saying to him, Ralph, this isn't good enough. And I said, you've made this commitment to the community. You're not meeting your obligations. And he said, well, why are we worried about that? That's social, not economic. I said, Ralph, for the communities involved, this is economic. Mm-hmm. This is pretty basic economic. I go to the Total, the French multinational who was doing the mine at Skookum. They were a total pain in the butt in terms of the provisions. Everything we had to hammer home. Okay, this many training jobs, this many positions, this, that, and the other thing. But because they had lots of experience in Africa, When we went to do the compliance audit a year later, they had done 99% of what they said they'd do. I didn't know that. I mean, I worked in mines. But companies have characters too. Companies have personalities. Companies have values. Some have very high quality ethical standards. Others don't. And I think, on the stock market, the people who are investors are looking at, well, what are the returns on that investment? But for an Indigenous community, it cannot be that.
Right. So that really, and let's go there, that really brings a crux of a problem of that we have these investors, these shareholders that have such short-term horizons and they want immediate results and, continual profits. On the opposite side, you have the landholders, the rights holders, those who occupy the land and depend on the land in many ways, see this this activity that doesn't take into consideration that long-term generational use. And so how do you reconcile that?
Well, there's a whole bunch of ways, and we'll get into the discussion about them. But I'll just give you one answer, which I heard from the Total guy. This is a French multinational, huge, got mines all over the place. I said, well, tell me, the 99% is pretty good performance in terms of your commitments you made. Does that come out of your African experience? He said, yes. I said, so tell me about that. He said, the first thing we do when we go into a community in Africa is we go looking for the local Indigenous person who can become the mine manager in 5 years. Who can we train? Maybe it's the chief's son, whatever. It's somebody that we can say, as soon as we can get there, we're going to get somebody who's seen as a local authority, got credibility, got connections, is already a leader in some way. What we can do is train them as a mine manager.
Right.
That's what the Canadian company in Alaska on that lead zinc mine has not done.
And so bringing that into this context, you have the Selkirk First Nation that has now taken over Minto Mine, and they're the majority owner. Now it's called Selkirk Copper. So I think that's breaking that. It's breaking that paradigm. Now the land holder, the rights holder, is becoming the primary investor, and so I think that's starting to get to that model of, and the story has yet to be told there, but that's such an exciting news story. And then you look at what was recently announced with, and this is early days, hasn't been tested yet, but you got Snowline, who just made an announcement with Notchunag Dun First Nation, where they get free, prior, and informed consent on any mining activity that happens.
Which they should have anyway, because it's the law in BC.
That's right. And I was actually talking with some of my colleagues that were saying that in northern BC that is pretty standard. But this is pretty innovative stuff for what we're dealing with. So and then we have.
But let me just say one thing. There's an area here where everybody, First Nation, company, have to get into a no bullshit agreement. One of the things I had a guy, I won't mention his name because he's still very much a major mining person, a guy who runs a company on the New York Stock Exchange with half a dozen mines, South America here and everything. And he was dealing with a northern First Nation, again, I won't name them, who wanted to take over a property which he actually owns. I mean, he's not averse to a partnership, but they wanted to basically run it. And they said, we want to be the mine manager. And he knew, and he said to me, this is just insane. You cannot go take someone who's never been in a mine, but who is a chief, and run a mine. Now, some people would point to Mount Skookum, which was a coal mine run by the Casca, Carmack's Little Salmon First Nation for a long time. And they were a United Steelworkers local union, but the people who ran the mine, which was to actually provide coal for Faro, and under its previous incarnation, had work that it had to work it on a basically labor pool basis, where the chief would basically assign people to go work in the days, but in hunting season, maybe only 2 guys would turn up for work. The rest of the time, when people wanted wages, that you would have a full workforce. There's a whole different model, maybe a strange hybrid of a unionized workforce working really under the leadership of the chief, at least in terms of the labor allocation. So there are experiments and inventions that have to go on like that because we haven't done it. I mean, everybody in the territory has been involved in discussions about casino, and I think as many as 5 First Nations are in one way or the other interested in that. And it's a very interesting ore body, but given what's happened recently, the problem is that the ore they really want to get at requires the gold. The most easiest way for them to get at it is heap leaching.
Right.
Well, there ain't going to be any heap leaching in the Yukon for at least another 10 years, I imagine, if ever again, given what's happened, right?
And we can get into that.
Yeah.
You know, that is such a unique thing to shareholder driven.
All these learning,
overriding.
the experiential, the learning you have to do on the site. And it means that Yukoners have to admit what they don't know. But the mining companies also have to be prepared to share what they do know, what they know, and to talk together. So let me give you one example of what can be done.
That's right. That's where I want to go with this.
Because I was in northern Norway, way up in a fjord, quite far north.
Okay.
A lead battery plant operating, I think, for 100 years. I'm not quite sure. The benefit they had was 1 cent a kilowatt hour power from a hydro dam built in the last century.
That's pretty cheap.
Yeah, extremely cheap. But it was a sunk asset. I mean, the capital was done, whatever money had got has been paid off. But the way that place operated astonished me. I'm going around, and they're giving me a tour. So I'm still an elected politician there, so I talk to people. I ask them about where they're from and, what do they do. Every single person I talked to in that mine was born in that town. I've never seen a mine like that in northern Canada. Well, how did that happen? Well, the company, long ago, because it's been there for a very long time, and by the way, thinking of environmental things, this plant is right close to an apple orchard and a fishery operation. That's how serious the Norwegians are about environmental standards. The way it worked was, and 2 things I'm going to tell you about this. If a school teacher in grade 6 spotted a kid who had science aptitude, their job was they were instructed to go see the company. The company will then come and see that kid's parents. And they will say to that kid's parents, your child has aptitude for science. If they want to become an engineer or a scientist or a geologist or any of the people we associate with this plant, we will pay for their university on condition that when they come back, they'll spend 5 years back here. And it doesn't matter, boy or girl, same deal. In consequence, what happened, the company knew smart enough, what happened if you take a young person, you pay their way through university, they come and they get a job back in their own community, and there's a young woman who has exactly the same experience, they meet, they hook up, they get married, they have kids, they're permanent residents. They're not there for 5 years, they're there for life. And they've got a permanent workforce, they got a knowledgeable workforce. The second thing I noticed about that plant, you never see in a Canadian mine. Everywhere I went, and every floor in that plant, there were lab setups, lab benches, experimental tests. And I said, what are these things? They said, well, we're constantly checking for new circuits, new methods, new apologies, all this stuff. This is a place in the far north. I said, well, why do you do this? Well, they said 30% of our revenue comes from international marketing of our innovations.
Wow.
Have you ever seen a Canadian mining company doing that?
I don't think I've seen any company doing that.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the kind of consciousness. Now, part of it's a Nordic cultures because we forget that the Industrial Revolution actually started in Sweden in the 19th century, long before England. That's where you usually talk about it. Because there is that inventiveness. Another version of the same story. When the mine at Kiruna, which once employed 5,000 people, now operates with 50 people, all old guys, because they have seniority provisions under the union agreement, all gray-haired guys in lab coats over their work clothes, are now running the computers that run the mine, including underground railroads and, everything's automated. What happened to the guys who got laid off? So they took me around to see some of them. And a number of these people who were technical guys, pretty technically aptitude guys, but had invented small businesses based on their mining experience. So one of them had built. He had farmland, but he had a lot of forest trees on it. And he discovered the wood was ideal for certain kind of furniture, moldings on the bottom of the walls. Mm-hmm. And he had developed a computer-controlled program to design and shape molding on demand from buyers anywhere in the country. His wood was in racks outside on the land, air cured, and then he would shape it with his invented machine for whatever demands. And someone whispered to me the level of his profits from that was just astonishing. But another guy, also from the same mine, had done something nobody else had done anywhere in the world at that point. He had invented a robot that could put screws on bolts.
Okay.
Small muscle control, something you can teach a human to do. Mm-hmm. They'd never taught a machine to do it before.
Right.
And, these were guys who'd gone from being union miners to entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. It wasn't such a leap because they created a culture where that was natural and normal and so forth. So anyway, I'm going all over the map.
No, but let's keep going on that example. So, and there was more to that, right? Like the centers of education, supporting it, you're mentioning it, building a community. But how do we replicate that?
Well, the first thing, let me just give you one example. You don't know this person, but I'm going to tell you his name. There's a guy named Wilson Perisic. He's still alive. He's in Burnaby. He's 84, something like that. He was a farm boy, Ukrainian farm boy, originally from Saskatchewan, but his family, the farm, I think, went under or something, and moved to Winnipeg at some point. So he became a Rhodes Scholar. How did he become a Rhodes Scholar? He told me the story about this. It's really interesting. He was a very high-performing student, but he was also the highest-scoring junior hockey player in Manitoba. And the Rhodes Committee, the Rhodes Scholarship Committee in Manitoba, were all hockey fans. That's why he got the nod somewhere else. So he goes to Oxford, studies economics, comes back, he offered a job with Foreign Affairs in Canada right away, and then found out he'd have to wait 10 years before he became an ambassador anywhere. So Manitoba offered him a job. He's 26 now. The Premier of Manitoba calls him up, knows who he is. I mean, it's a small province. Everybody knows him. They knows this guy's near genius, right? Says, I've got to build a new hydroelectric plant. It's going to take 10 years, limestone, major project in northern Manitoba. Would you run the project? He's not an engineer. He's an economist. He said, well, on certain conditions. What are the conditions? Well, the conditions are I want to train an Indigenous workforce to build the place. Can't be done overnight, but so what's your plan? Well, he said, I'm going to talk to some people. I want to talk to the union's headquarters in Winnipeg, and I want to talk to the companies and stuff. He said, but I really believe this is important, Indigenous workforce. And Premier said, well, what's your goal? My goal is, because they're all First Nation villages around this site for this limestone project. He said, I want to guarantee them at the end of the 10-year construction project that every community will leave behind a First Nation carpenter, plumber, electrician, whatever other trades they want, and they will learn those trades on this job. Now, it is actually easier said than done because it turns out the electrical union or whatever union in Winnipeg was not keen on having a bunch of guys. And part of the reason they claimed not to be because, in fact, the rules in that province at that time said you had to have grade 10 math or something like that to get into carpentry or worse, physics in order to get into something else. So Wilson realized he was going to have to reinvent the apprenticeship program. And he went there and he talked to some chiefs, and the chief said, well, that's not the way we learn. We don't learn from books. We learn from experiential learning. We learn by watching elders do things and how they do them. So they ran a test. I mean, I'm not giving you the full picture, but basically the test was get a bunch of these kids who potentially work there, potentially of age so they could go work in this mine. You have some couple of elders take a car apart right down to the tiniest parts and then see which ones can put it back together from watching somebody else do it. Mm-hmm. Those are the guys who got to be the apprentices.
So aptitude tests.
Yeah. It's essentially that. Yeah. It's not a book test. It's actually experiential learning.
Yeah.
which is in an indigenous tradition, right? So you learn. I mean, a Tlingit guy once told me from Alaska, he said, well, in our tradition, and he's talking about Tlingit Alaska, he said, a young man is taught by his mother's brother.
Right.
He said a young woman is taught by the sister of the father. And whether it's hunting or whatever, it's not the mother and father, it's a kind of 1 degree away from that. And so he actually succeeded. And one of the things the other did, which I have argued for here and failed, make mining a designated trade. So it's a red seal trade. You can't send an untrained person underground where they will be putting not only their own life at risk, but the other miners at risk. You have to have people trained to do that stuff. Mm-hmm. So he made mining a designated trade. And so,
okay.
So I took what he'd done and I put it in Chapter 22. What has the government done about that? Absolutely nothing.
Right.
But to be honest, neither have the First Nations.
Right.
So here's what should have happened. Right now, we've got a school system designed for the 15% of the students who are actually going to go to university. We have 2 schools in the Yukon with essentially something like a shop program. Bob Sharp out in Ross River and what's his name up in Dawson City, I know him, I'm just gapping on his name. You need that in every school. Because most of the kids that are going to be in the class, male or female, are not going to university. And it's no good to keep them there till they're in grade 12, then throw them out into the job market when they've got no skills to go there. What you need is apprenticeship programs, which are run jointly by companies and unions, because you have to bring them into this discussion, because they're the people who know what the trades need, what the workers need. And you say, like I would say, I've already made this pitch to Casino, by the way, that if you're serious about bringing in Indigenous people, you have to actually take those languages, unfortunately loosey-goosey language in Chapter 22, and say, this is what you need to do. You want to have a trained workforce and you want to have Indigenous workforce, you've got to offer apprenticeship programs. But so is the Department of Education. I mean, they've talked about it, but they've never actually done anything. And they need to say, we're going to have a separate program. Most provinces, and by the way, most European countries have this, they recognize there are some kids going to go to university and some kids are going to go be suited for technologies and trades, draftsmen, whatever, And you start to offer those programs, so they leave school, this is the norm in Europe, with 2 years of a 4-year apprenticeship complete already.
Right.
So they're actually useful. You can hire them. They can go to work right away. And they finish their apprenticeship and on the job, and then got a trade, which is they can keep them working for the rest of their lives. And you've got people here in the Yukon, I've met them, who call themselves carpenters, who took a 6-week course at Yukon College. They're not carpenters. But there are other people who've actually qualified as carpenters, and you shouldn't be mixing up those two.
Right.
You should be talking to the people who are really carpenters. Anyway, that's my failure. Well, I mean, we passed the treaty and we didn't get into government for very long, but if I'd been around, I would have said, Department of Education, every school, you got to start looking at this and doing it, and they haven't done it. So it's one of the failures. It's not just a failure of YTG; it's also the failure of First Nations, I think, too.
Right. So what you're saying is just not building in that into the school curriculum, in the infrastructure of the schools, having the ability to learn, be introduced to trades, to build that growing passion. So, and then by the time they leave high school, they're well on their way of apprenticeships.
2 years towards an electrician, or 2 years a plumber, or electrician, or I mean, there's some funny ironies, but where Alaska should be useful elections. So I've heard this story many times about Alaska, and I don't know who told me. It doesn't matter. Before land claims in Alaska, 1971, every village had a carpenter. What did the carpenter do? Granny wanted there's 2 new babies, twins born, need an extra bigger porch and 1 extra bedroom. Carpenter comes and just goes and does it. Somebody else has moved back to the community, needs a tiny house, go build it. One of the things that Congress did with the land claim said, well, we don't, and there's Mickey Mouse is that, every village has got to have a housing corporation. So guess what? This guy who's a carpenter, perfectly good carpenter, now has to run a housing corporation. Guess what? Within no time at all, they had dozens of bankrupt housing corporations because they didn't go to business school. They don't know how to do bookkeeping and all that stuff. Perfectly good carpenters, but it's a kind of misapplication of. It's a theory that I heard someone in Alaska one time. The land claim, in some sense, for the first few years, got ruined by the Harvard MBA school. They flooded into the state to actually tell them how to run their corporations, and they really didn't know how to run corporations owned by Indigenous people.
Right. So maybe this is a good time to transition to that. So the Yukon First Nation Chamber of Commerce just had a trade mission to Alaska. And it's interesting because my dad, Doug Hogan, who was on the original trade mission 30 years ago into Alaska, part of the Teza and Tlingit learning experience of, learning from that context of, those settlement agreements, those compensation dollars into corporate structures. How have you organized yourselves? How have you developed out and prospered?
Right.
And back then, we were 15, 20 years behind them.
Yeah.
And so just this year or last year, we sent a delegation of CEOs and trusts to Alaska. And my dad was once again on that trade mission representing the trust that he sits on. And they were 15, 20 years ahead of us,
right.
Once again. But these, what was interesting, to what that maturity has really blossomed in. Those CEOs are Indigenous people from those communities, and their executive and their board and their upper management are well represented of their communities. And then these corporations are multi-billion international. They're selling products to 40 states and beyond, and their Department of Defense suppliers, and they're at a whole other level, which is mind blowing. And and I would say to a larger or lesser degree, our C-suite development corps aren't exactly representative of the communities yet, but I have hope. I'm an Indigenous person from my community. I don't know if there would be a role for me in that place, or if many Indigenous educated members of the communities see themselves in an upper trajectory. I don't know if that recruitment, like all those things you said, need to occur for that. You got to prime that line.
Right.
You got to build that infrastructure. You got to express that interest, seek that aptitude, cultivate and mentor and bring through the channels. I wouldn't say it's exclusive. I would say that there are First Nation groups that are doing that.
Right.
But I would say it's maybe not systematic. It's not totally across the board yet. But I think that is when we go on that trade mission, we see that. And I wasn't there. I was in Iceland, but I've talked to a lot of people that were. It was very impressive. Yeah. When you see somebody who is of the Indigenous community, who is the CEO, right, who's probably got a Harvard MBA degree, so those Harvard, what that experience you're talking about, these Harvard MBAs that flooded in without the context, didn't do so well. Yeah. But then once they groomed that they groomed and embedded that educational framework into the local community to be able to represent on that high level. Yeah. These are very successful businesses.
Well, I remember being in Juneau one time, and I'm sure these numbers are wrong, but it basically said, right after the land claim, the Sea Alaska Corporation, for example, which has got lots of very nice assets, had a Tlingit president and a Tlingit janitor, and nobody in between.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that's probably an exaggeration, but that's, Now, of course, everything's indigenized from top to bottom. Mm-hmm. But there's an interesting thing that Steve Cooper told me, who was the governor then. They had the problem, as we do, of residential schools closing. And two things about that were really interesting. One, that the under Indigenous management of the same school, the same physical building, now with Native women as the, I don't know what they call them, the minding the kids, looking after their sleeping arrangements and all that kind of stuff, and Indigenous faculty teaching them not just their own languages, which some of them knew, but also Russian and Japanese, the people they're trading with. The school, which had been a disaster as a residential school, was now a high-performing school, very high university entrance levels, graduates, and number of people going on to professions. But what was interesting about that was when it came, this happened before the land claim, right? But when the land claim happened, there was a very interesting development because the Congress, some of the negotiators, the federal negotiators, this is the legend, decided they could play off one tribal group against another. The Inuit against the First Nations and the Tlingit against the other First Nations, the Athabascans. But it didn't work. And you know why? Because those friendships that those guys had made in high school on basketball teams and so forth that had endured. And when they went to the table with the federal government was surprised. These guys had their act together. They had already talked through the issues. They weren't going to allow themselves to be divided as they were planning to do. Now, there were some bad things, as you know, came out of that deal. The whole idea that the land is going to be owned not by the tribes and under tribal government, but under development corporations. That was a kind of very capitalist kind of idea. I don't know whether it's worked or whether it's not worked, but the point is it's very different than the arrangement we have in the Yukon, right?
Yeah, and let's go back to that. So, we kind of skipped over your introduction there a little bit and dove right into mining, but you were the premier of the Yukon, and your riding was
Whitehorse West.
Whitehorse West, okay. And
but can I go back a little bit further?
Because yes, please.
What happened is I came back to the university in 1969. I went to work at Clinton Creek. A lot of immigrant workers there. So when the chief shop steward, who was a brilliant guy, British guy, he came from a working class family, but his sister had become a British diplomat. She was actually an ambassador. And this only happened after the Second World War. You couldn't have had a working class kid become a diplomat before the Second World War, when big revolution, social change. And his brother had become the MP for their area on the Scottish border. And he was the MP for 26 years. These were working class people. And he was a guy who had not even passed high school. But when I went in and took over from him as the chief shop steward, dealing with grievances about health and other things, there was these brilliant, argued cases that he'd brought in grievances and in arbitrations and so forth, because he'd grown up in a family where they talked about this stuff at the dinner table. He'd learned it at home, not at school, right? But it was also a larger cultural thing where people were talking about things. So that was really interesting. But when I go there, and I become the chief shop steward when he leaves, his girlfriend got lost in a missing plane, and he went try and find her, and I got elected substitute. Not because I think I was smart or I'd been to university, but because I actually spoke English and some French. And all of the management of the mine were French. Most of the people working there were actually from Germany or Spain or Holland or whatever, and their English was not great. They weren't confident. So it was a very kind of conflict kind of thing. And even though there was a First Nation community right next door, hardly anybody there working. Partly that's a problem, shift work problem. I think the interesting thing was I go around Dawson City then, and I'm on the streets of Whitehorse because I was here too. There were one thing that was obvious to me. The thing that struck me right smack in the face. The reality about the Yukon was that First Nation people were poor, and most of the poor people here were First Nation. That it wasn't just unlucky people or untrained people. This was built into the society structure by residential school, by a failure to treat people seriously, by the failure to treat them equally, the failure to... I'll tell you, this is a funny story. I'll probably be pretty careful not to mention names there. But there was a First Nation person that you know who was made by a South African mine manager. Think about that. The most racist country in the world. The people that Donald Trump now wants to come be the number one immigrants for the United States. He did a thing which no other mine manager had done. He made a First Nation miner, underground miner, the shift boss on the mine. And he did it with intent. But the guy couldn't last. And you know why he couldn't last?
Why?
Not because of the racism of the management, but the racism of his fellow workers, the guys he had to supervise. And in the end, he went back to doing what he was doing before. I mean, that was a reality. That's the 1960s, but still, it was a reality. So even someone who was bright, talented, smart, perfectly capable of doing the job was not able to do the job because his people he was supervising would make his life unpleasant.
Right.
Now, probably didn't happen in your community or your family, but I bet it happened in a lot of other places in the Yukon, where even when a humane, visionary management said, we want to bring First Nation people in, you can't just do it on a whim with an individual. You've got to actually have a plan. You've got to think it through. How do you get these people? How do you train them? And part of the way you train them is, of course, if you put them in apprenticeships with other Native people, but other non-Native people as well, they develop a camaraderie, a professional kind of brotherhood or sisterhood, and don't have any problem working. So I'm going to come back to Wilson Parrick's experiments now with the limestone hydro project. He made mining a designated trade.
Right.
So there were young guys who went and became underground miners. Years later, I come back and I'm given the job in northern Saskatchewan under Roy Romano. This is, what year is this? This would be 1995. He's got a problem, a $16 billion problem. And the problem is he's got 3 huge uranium mines ready to go, one owned by a German company, one owned by a French company, one owned by a Canadian company, but which had been 2 Crown corporations, which were now got privatized by Brian Mulroney and Grant Devine in Saskatchewan. The NDP had nationalized, they nationalized potash, but uranium had been under Crown corporations since the war when it was used to make bombs.
Okay.
So he says to me, got a problem, because, and I said, what's the problem? He said, we have an environmental assessment process that's been going on for 7 years with no end in sight. The previous Conservative government has left us billions of dollars in debt. We need these mines open and people working in the northern, because they're all in the far north of the province, trained and working, so we can actually get our economy turned around, because these mines represent $1 billion a year in revenue for us. But and the environmental assessment process was a joint federal-provincial process, so the Canada and Saskatchewan agreed to a joint process. So he said, they're nonstop talking, and then we don't see any end for this process. They're just going on and on and on and on and on, and environmentalists coming to these meetings. So he said, I don't know what to do. He said to me, would you take a look at it? So I said, okay, but what I want to do is I want to go into the communities where these mines are going to be. They're all Dene communities. They speak Denisulan, which is a slightly different dialect than is spoken by the Dene groups in the Yukon, but they can be understood in certain ways. Same kinds of communities, basically hunting, fishing, trapping kind of communities. And Alan Blakeney, who had been the premier, wasn't premier, this was Romano at the time, had set a goal of 66% native hire for these mines. Well, 2 things I'll come back to. One, first of all, nobody did anything about training. Didn't know how to do it. So Wilson Parrick, though, had done these underground mining things, the designated trade. I go in and I look at a new shaft that's going in on one of these uranium mines. The development miners are different. They're not in production. They're miners. They're just sinking the shaft. I go over and say that. They're all First Nation guys who've been working, doing this work, earning 6-figure incomes, month on, month off, so they still had family connection, since Wilson had put this program in. And they hadn't walked away and done something else. They were earning 6-figure incomes. Mm-hmm. They were happy as hell, continued to do it. And they got to spend every other month with their family and their kids, and they've been all over the world. And they were now putting these mines in, not in Manitoba, but in Saskatchewan. It was a success story in that limited sense. So that was really interesting to see that and to hear about that. These guys were there. The problem with Wilson's plan was this idea that you're going to leave behind an electrician, carpenter, plumber, so forth. Because what happened is, because there are no roads connecting the Yukon, those communities in northern Manitoba, unlike the Yukon, where you could be a plumber in Mayo and you can go work in Carcross or Selkirk or Dawson. They were stranded assets, except for the carpenters. This goes back to the Alaska story. Carpenters could always stay busy, but not necessarily the other trades. And that was a problem he didn't think through, and he didn't recognize it till after it was over. And that's what happens. You learn, you experiment, you do, and things work and things that don't work. I think, going back to this was at Whitehorse Copper, the First Nation shift bus, there would have been a better way of doing it. Not rather than doing a token of one guy, you could have, because that mine manager also let the first woman in Yukon to be an underground miner. First ever. She also became the first tradesperson in the Yukon. She also became a carpenter.
Okay. And was there more success there?
Well, she did. She succeeded in both, but she was the end of one person, and the one person in a crowd of people who are not them. I mean, if you're a woman working underground, you want to get other women there.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So for comfort of it, not to be the only one. So Piers MacDonald told me there's a woman who actually had roots in Whitehorse, Didi Skareko, whose mother had been, this is an interesting story, Hilda Hellaby. I don't know whether you ever knew her. She was a deaconess of the Anglican Church here in Whitehorse, and very old lady, died a long time ago, but she had been the first woman in Canada ever allowed to adopt, a single woman ever allowed to adopt a child. And she adopted an orphan Chinese baby in downtown east side of Vancouver, and then got sent by her church to the Yukon. That young woman ended up going to Elsa and marrying a miner, and their daughter, part Chinese, became the first woman underground miner at Elsa. And Piers she apprenticed under Piers. Why? Because he was the only miner who agreed to have a woman as apprentice.
Okay.
It's a funny kind of connections that these pieces, it's a jigsaw puzzle you have to put together, and all the pieces have to come together. And some will fit, some won't.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to get to the other thing. Let me just tell you the other thing about Saskatchewan, which is interesting. So Blakeney had a good thing, said 66% native hire. You took a hard look at the numbers. There weren't enough First Nation people of the right age to actually fill a 66% quota. So it may have been like a commitment, but it wasn't one you could actually apply. And it wasn't a bad thing, but the president of the largest company, which was a French guy with a PhD in chemistry from Sorbonne, who was the largest, he was the president of the company which had been two crown corporations, one federal, one provincial, was now Cameco, which is a private company now. And they had an ore body at Blair that was so rich, you couldn't believe it. It's like, wasn't far below the surface. It was 5 miles long, something like that. And like a 5% grade uranium, commercial grade uranium is about 2%. This was 5% grade, just below the surface. It was an ore body so hot you couldn't put a miner anywhere near it. They had to invent a new method of mining it, which is actually, hot slurried water underneath the ore body, then through lead line pipes into trucks, personally designed for this. Anyway, what happened, the guy, president of the mine, came to me, because I was now the guy dealing with this problem. And he said, look, Tony, we want to do the 66. We absolutely want to do it, but we can't. And I said, well, why not? He said, because we as a company are not going to put a underground miner who cannot read a dosimeter. What's a dosimeter? It's the thing the instrument they have to wear that if the radiation levels get below a certain level, they get out right now. And you need grade 10 math to be able to read one of these things. And if you can't read a dosimeter, we're not going to let them in the mine. Forget what the government says. This is not a crappy Vancouver Stock Exchange mining company. This is a serious human being who says, I'm not going to put people at risk to mine this ore body. Anyway, so I have to listen to this. I have to say, he's not going to do it. And it's interesting because there was an issue there because there were two different standards about what were safe exposure levels to uranium. And I ended up recommending we do the tougher one, partly because a lot of environmental concerns. But part of that is actually talking to and listening to not just the Indigenous people, but also the company and also the unions. You have to actually learn to do that. And I suspect, I don't know how the Liberal Minister of Mines here who was trained as an engineer, how good a job he did of actually sitting down and listening to him, because Tony Hodge, who wrote the post-project report on Faro, he's a mining engineer, PhD from UBC, from Queens actually, but professor at UBC. And back in the 70s, he was an active environmentalist in the Yukon. He was actually with what was it called? The Yukon, whatever it was called at the time. Good guy. But he's written this like big fat report on what went wrong in Faro. Like big fat book. Interesting. Everybody should read it who's interested in mining. Anyway, he's actually a believer in the circular economy. If you really want to understand money, you've got to talk about taking them from the time you take the ore body out, mine it, process it, use it, manufacture with it, then you've got to find a way to put it back into the ground so it continues the circle. It's an ecological view, but it's a view which says that at the end of the project, it's not just waste that you throw in a giant pile. You actually should realize it still has potential to be processed. And it's a worldview that he has. But anyway, you should read the Faro report sometime. It's really, really interesting. I don't know how many people read it. I read it. But anyway, I think there's lots of learning to do. I don't think Yukon College is set up well to do it. It's trying to do too many things and not doing them well. That's my opinion.
Yukon University now.
Well, even worse as a university, because as a university, you can't afford to fail like this.
Yeah.
But I go back to the Finnish example of Roman University, 4 faculties only, all geared to local needs. They can't keep teachers, so they have a teacher training school. They can't keep public servants, and there you have to have a master's degree in administrative law to be a senior civil servant. So we're going to have a school to do that. We're going to have a school to do teachers. And we're going to have another program. Oh, it's an arts program, because the guy who redesigned the town after the Second World War and the Nazis burned it to the ground, built it with all modern Nordic design, like big white walls, blonde wood, big windows to catch northern light. I mean, it's a beautiful place. It looks very different than anywhere. It's not the standard Vancouver architecture coming up here and plonked on the ground. It's actually designed for the north, because it's the area where the Sami live in Finland. In fact, when I was there, the chancellor of the university was actually a Sami, but a scholar, someone with a PhD, not just a token. He was a serious scholar. So that university works. It has tons of Canadians there doing PhDs, 4 faculties only, entirely focused on what that northern community needed. We've got 25, 30 programs going on at Yukon University. I'm guessing 5 of them work.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I don't tell you.
But it's a problem. It's a problem. Everything from who's on the board to who's the faculty, and you know, we opened the place not as a university but as a college when we were in government. And we had good discussions about it. I mean, I remember, this is an example where 2 Indigenous women in our caucus said, well, we can't have a university which doesn't have without any early childhood education thing there. So, okay, we can't have a university without a daycare. So we need a program to train daycare workers, and we need dormitories for young women coming from the communities. We can't just let them off from the housing market here. There's a whole bunch of needs that come out of there, which Margaret, Commodore, Joe, and Norma Cassie are basically saying, these are the things we need to do. None of the men in our group had thought through this stuff at all. Mm-hmm. Now, that was not a thinking of it as a faculty, or it was a cross-cutting, as a cultural thing right across the thing. How do you do this stuff? But here's the problem. I think I'm going to come to it later, but I'm trying to think this through a lot. I don't know what it's like in your community, but one of the problems I've casually observed when we're trying to implement self-government is the problem is, and Miles Richardson, do you know Miles Richardson? Former Grand Chief of the Haida Nation.
No.
He used to come into my class every year when I was teaching at Simon Fraser. He said, okay, Yeah, there's lots of interesting things about our culture, the fact that we had slaves, And he said, but, the fact of the matter is, there's nobody alive that has a clue how we were governed 1,500 years ago. And what's the only model of government we have? It's Indian affairs, which is the one model of government we don't want. So it's a problem of actually inventing all over again. And we don't know whether we're making a mistake. We don't know if we're doing the right thing. We can do language revival, yes, and there's a lot of wisdom just in knowledge of language, but it's not easy. But I think all those pieces sort of have to go together. And I think everybody. I'm a New Democrat, a social democrat, and everybody would say, well, the social democrats are famous for social policy things, Tommy Douglas, Medicare, Jagmeet Singh, dental program and childcare funding. But that's actually nonsense. Tommy Douglas in Saskatchewan created crown corporations that did stuff that nobody else would do in energy and in others. Tommy Douglas encouraged co-ops because small communities that couldn't afford to have a store could then create a store, create a credit union, do that kind of stuff. There was a whole cultural thing there. I think that the great mistake of people on the Democratic left, and you could include some liberals in this and then sort of the NDP types, is they're too focused on social policy. They don't think clearly about economics. In fact, they're afraid of economics. They think it's all for businessmen. It's all for big rich guys and stuff. So economy's not about rich people. The economy's about everybody, right? And if I had to say a worldview of what's wrong with the world, my view is there are too many billionaires and there are too many billions of poor people. If you look at the happy, socially successful countries in the world, index happiness of the countries with large middle class, but relatively few rich people and relatively few poor people, and the Nordic countries are famous for this. They are the happiest places on the planet, including Holland and a place like that, because they don't have extremes of wealth and poverty, a lot of it. They don't have too much extremes of poverty. Right. They have, everybody's been trained, everybody has a job, everybody knows how to work. You have an education system which is geared about not just learning some history and some math, it's about how do you prepare for your life and your work in the world, which is what we should be doing. We're not. I mean, I think I don't know our education system well enough, and Pierre's tried to do big reforms, but I don't know that we've done enough reform. I think the First Nation school board, is that what it's called? Yeah. Is a good thing, but I don't know whether it is going to succeed because the big institutional apparatus we've got already existing is very hard to change. I mean, teachers are trained not into this, so they can be willingly participate, but they all went to the same kind of teacher colleges that taught the same kind of ways of doing things.
But I think it's a good first step.
I'm not criticizing.
I hear you too, but it's trying to do that incremental change.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think the key word is everybody thinks that people on the left, Democratic left, liberal, social democrats, NDP or whatever, are too focused on spending. What we need to think about is investing.
Yeah.
And you can do it in social policy. And I'll give you Gay Hansen?
Yes.
Métis from Manitoba, who was my first Aboriginal deputy in Yukon.
Okay.
Deputy Minister of Health and Social Services. We wrote an act, a health act, which says that the first 5 cents of every health dollar has to be spent in health promotion and disease prevention. In other words, invested, not spent. You know what happened in the system? Everybody, doctors, lawyers, nurses, lab technicians, all of a sudden said, well, I do disease prevention and health promotion. Well, maybe, but what we were trying to argue was we need to build a case for saying that we need, before people get sick, is how do we prevent it? Not just spending the money on healing. And it's a connection between what we're talking about in terms of the economy, because it's actually investing is what we should be doing rather than just spending. And I think if I say a thing about YTG, they don't think about investing enough. They're basically thinking about spending. They're thinking, Deputy Minister of Education is thinking about what the education budget is going to be, the health budget this year or whatever. They're not thinking about how do we create a pool, and then they come back to the contrast between BC and Norway. British Columbia and Norway have almost identical natural resources. BC doesn't have as much oil as Norway, but same population, 5 million. British Columbia is in a financial crisis because they don't have enough money to meet all the demands. Norway, with the same size population, the same traditional economy, has created a sovereign wealth fund of $1 trillion. They will be able to last for another century after the oil's all gone because they have invested.
Right. And they've kept it out of that cyclical cycle of get rich and create these kind of
But also
busts.
they've kept it out of Tory government, Liberal government, Social Democratic government by putting all parties on the board from the beginning. So it's not our Social Democrats' achievement, although it is. We get everybody feeling an ownership of the thing from the beginning, which is why it hasn't disappeared.
Right. Can I take you back?
Yep.
Can we go back to...
Can I take a sip of water?
Yes, yes, yeah.
I'm finding my throat.
So let's go back to... so you started...
Sorry, this is not a very logical discussion. We should be...
No, this is great.
Yeah.
This is great. That's what the whole point is this informal back and forth, and there's no set way to do this. I think we're just having a conversation. So before we started, you talked about the unique composition of your cabinet, of your ministers, and I want to capture that, but I want us to go back to that, and you started setting the table a little bit, talking about how the Yukon looked before devolution, before the final agreements, before there was more economic certainty and more development that was happening because of the certainty from the final agreements and why there was final agreements. And why don't you paint that picture a little bit about kind of what was the Yukon like, and I've heard different stories from different people about there wasn't a lot of investment dollars and things were pretty flat, and there were businesses, but they were starving for capital. There was and you started saying there were things like the Yukon College being developed, Yukon Development Corp, to create a collective entity to build out infrastructure and collective assets that is required for this new economy that needed to be built. Just to set that table a little bit, and how
okay, let me be
that collection of people
random about it. So we have the glorification of prospectors there. The guy with the couple of metal things go out and banging on rocks and trying to find the next gold mine and stuff. And there was a kind of glorification of this iconic figure. But were they the key figures in the Yukon economy? I don't know. If they had success, they left immediately. Robert Service, you get some money and you go, right? And because of the geology, we're always going to have mining of some kind. But it's whether we have sensible mining or mining as a living part of the community instead of just gangbanging, coming in, getting the stuff and getting out. There is an alternative, and some of them are emerging. We've talked about in Boise's Bay, and Tim Kepke, who I admire. He's an engineer. He's not stupid on these things. Thinks the small mill idea is a bad idea because too much depends on metal prices, what will happen, or whether a company will expand production or reduce production. I'm sure that's all true, but I do think also the Tony Hodge idea of the circular is actually a healthier one in the long run.
So there's differing views of people that you really hold in high esteem.
Yeah, and I'd like to see the continuing debate with them, but those people don't tend to get elected to the legislature. They don't tend to be. One of the other things that really pisses me off about Chapter 2 is the Council on the Economy and Environment.
Right.
We created for exactly that purpose that environmentalists, the chambers of mines, chamber of commerce, and First Nations all sit down, as we did in the Yukon 2000 process, which was about agreement, talking about what we agree, to actually talk through some of these. It's not a decision-making body. It's a body, a clearinghouse for ideas and problems and so forth that we can actually talk about. The Tories went and abolished it. And I don't even think the abolition was illegal because it's in the Chapter 22. Unfortunately, when the churning of population here is something happens 10 years ago, half the people here in the population weren't even here then, so they don't even know or care. And I don't think the body had enough time to develop itself as it should have done. But it was a useful instrument because it actually operated before the land claims were settled. It was, and it actually came out of an idea from that trip to Scandinavia to see the way they were doing, because this was about sustainability. The whole idea about sustainability and about we're not just doing things to get money. The whole sustainability idea, and the idea that you get to the good ideas on this by, in fact, having groups talk to each other who don't normally interact, don't normally agree. So the Yukon 2000 process was a good start to that because, in fact, I remember we had I remember this vividly. A guy who was a placer miner, as a right wing as you could possibly imagine, basically thought Indians are a big nuisance, to get out of his way. Basically, he didn't say it that way, but that's what he thought. And then other people who were First Nation people who were respectful would listen to him but didn't agree with him. But the point is, I saw conversations that go on between people like that, and they found agreement. What did they agree on? The importance of fishery, and fish health. Not just as food, but as part of nature. And that's the kind of discussion we should be fostering. But of course, this legislative setup we've got, two warring parties facing each other, two sword lengths apart, obligated to say nasty things about each other, doesn't actually get you there, right? It doesn't get you to where you need to go in terms of sensible solutions to things. And I to try to think in my 20-some years in the political life here of the number of sensible debates, serious sensible debates in the legislature. Thank you for many.
Wow.
I can think of moments.
Yeah.
There was a moment when we were talking about what Dan Lang used to call the gay bill. Actually, it was a human rights bill, covering which Roger had put in some values about Indigenous rights as well. He wasn't supposed to, but he did. Roger, that's the way he was as a former judge. And there was this horrible debate one Wednesday night because we're in committee of the whole. We're done through second reading. We're now in the committee stage of the bill. And Willard, who was appealing to these right-wing loonies, there were the fundamentalist churches, the chambers of commerce, and somebody else, some other group got together, and they were stirring this up and shouting and yelling at public meetings because we had a committee that was going around hearing people. Anyway, Willard jumped on that bandwagon. I don't think he actually believed this crap he was saying, but he got up and he gave this speech one night. But if this bill passes, every rural community is going to have separate washrooms for gays. And he was just like plowing the thing. And it wasn't my bill, it was Roger's bill. So he was the guy who was supposed to be countering, I look up at the gallery with this weird stuff that Willard was saying, and the reporters all. So I got up. It wasn't my job, but as the leader, I got to interrupt sometimes. And I said, not angry, I'd asked the leader of the opposition, could he repeat what he just said? I'm not sure I understood what he was actually saying. So he said it again. And I said, well, could you just elaborate a little bit further on what you actually mean? And finally, the reporters woke up in the next day, and it was a big headline in the White Star, which was useful because two things happened. One, the next night, every riding had a public meeting on this thing, and most of them were horrible. Angry, shouting, nasty, ugly, ugly shows. My riding, different, Hillcrest. Much more liberal, much more middle class, a lot of public servants, a lot of teachers. And the mood had changed with that headline.
Right.
Everybody's now saying, these are fucking idiots. Pardon my language, sorry.
That's okay.
You could delete it out.
No, that's okay. It'll stay.
And Willard came up to me, which he didn't usually do, and said, well, he sort of changed his tune. And I said, then I gave a speech, which I said, I'm going to tell you something about your family you don't know. He said, what? I said, in the 1920s in British Columbia passed an anti-Asian act where you weren't allowed to sell your house to an Asian. You weren't allowed to employ Asian people. And this is talking about Chinese, Japanese people who were already coming into the East End. And I said, the leader of your party then, who later became Speaker of the House of Commons, what the hell was his name? He was the MP, Tory MP for the Yukon for years and years and years.
This was in the Yukon, these laws existed?
Well, no, it didn't exist.
Oh.
What happened, it passed in BC.
I see.
Then the guy who later became Speaker of the House of Commons, what was his name? He was the Tory MP for like forever. In the 1910, 1920s, from the gold rush on.
Okay.
I'll think of it. Sorry, I sometimes gap on names.
That's okay.
And he introduced the identical bill, Anti-Chinese, Anti-Oriental Act, or whatever, I can't remember what it was called, into the Yukon legislature. The Yukon Territorial Council, it was called at the time. And the opposition to it was led by Willard Phelps' grandfather and got it defeated here. So it passed in BC, became the law in BC, but not in the Yukon.
Right.
It actually got defeated here. So in my speech, I looked at Willard and said, I know this is an ugly debate, pretty unpleasant, and I'm glad my children aren't here to hear it. But I want you to know that I hope my grandchildren will be as proud of our side over here and saying what we're doing and the reform we're trying to do as you should be of your grandfather. And then I told him the story about what his grandfather had done. Mm-hmm. And he came up to me after, he said, I never knew that. Mm. He was embarrassed.
Yeah. You know, when you reflect on the legislature and kind of that debate style of politic, you know, from an Indigenous land claims General Assembly, which is now the, you know, this cultural meets contemporary model, this hybrid model of, you know, that we've now assembled ourselves and we have constitutions that reflect our cultural history. So we have in Teslin and some of the other First Nations cases, we have general council representatives that represent the clans. So it's this kind of representational structure, and all decisions have to occur through consensus. Yep. And so it's kind of this, in Teslin's case specifically,
which is sort of what, without saying that, we wanted the Yukon 2000 process.
Right. But I guess what the point I'm trying to make is that, and so as a business as well, you know, I own a business, and part of my business is supporting governments in their General Assembly. So I get to witness a lot, and regardless of how divisive or difficult the decision is to be had, there is always wholesome discussion. Very respectful dialogue. And it's not just the representatives, it's everybody. And, you know, part of our product is bringing everybody in through virtual means or however. And the you know, these difficult issues have huge debate, discussion, and always you end up in a better place than you were before. And everybody has a say in authorship in their resolutions that, you know, the laws that now are going to be implemented by that government. Yeah. So, you know, I think there's something very powerful and beautiful that has come out of the final agreement process that has materialized in the First Nation communities that now I think improves upon this legislative assembly process. And I've gone to the federal government and seen it in its worst form. Yep. You know, it's grandstanding to the ninth, and you know, it's all about
getting on television,
sound bites for TV. Yeah. And you see, and I don't, you know, you got some of them that are really good at that, and they've risen up through that mechanism. You know, is that great leadership? Yeah. Is that bringing Canada forward? Is that bringing Yukon forward? Right. Are we creating better laws because of that? Are we building an economy? Are we creating a society that is built out and represented of and supporting and nurturing
Yeah.
this better Yukon or better Canada? I don't think so.
Well, I look at what's going on in Milwaukee right now, and you just think this is horrible. This is. I mean, actually, Trump is following Hitler's playbook in the sense that you send troops into cities that don't vote for your party.
Yeah.
You send Jews on trains to Auschwitz. He sends brown people on planes to a concentration camp in El Salvador. Not been convicted of anything. Just put them on the plane, send them there. And then this kind of hate speech all the time, which is on the internet, on the media, and which is really horrible. But if who do the media cover? They cover question period because it's theater, it's conflict, it's a boxing match, it's whatever model you want. The thoughtful stuff gets done in committee of the whole.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And that is normally, that bill was an exception. But, there are moments when someone like Sam, when he became Speaker, the first Indigenous Speaker in Canada, maybe not because someone said there was an Inuk in Manitoba years ago, but anyway, the first for all of it was, who gave the prayer every day in Tlingit. Mm-hmm. Not a Tory dared criticize him for doing that.
Right. Because it wasn't part of your legislative process.
No, well,
right?
it is part of the process, but he also designed a speaker's robes that actually had clan symbols on it, not black. Black.
Broke protocol to a degree.
Yeah, broke protocol. But here's where Sam was so amazing sometimes. This is the cultural point. I think it's true that Yukon 2000, the evolution as a result of land claims and the way in which Indigenous governing bodies work and everything, all these things add up to something, as did Yukon 2000, is also the same thing. But Sam had two moments of utter brilliance, because as Speaker you don't participate in most debates, but you can in Committee of the Whole. And during this ugliness at one point, Phelps and Lang tried to embarrass Sam into taking a position, because they saw him as a traditional guy against gay rights and the Human Rights Act. And they went after him. And Sam just very quietly at some point stood up, because I came up with the direct question as, are you for these people? And Sam said something like this: two-spirited people have been with us forever and will ever be so. That's all he said.
Yeah. That's amazing.
Just like nothing else. Another time, which I think was brilliant, and why we so missed him, because even people Norma's age were not, and Margaret, who grew up in BC, Dave Porter, who grew up in BC, didn't really fully connect with this. I think it was Dan Langsbill or Howard Tracy, it doesn't matter. At some point they were arguing for another wolf call, so they'd be help hunters. And we're in the middle of this debate, which was pretty awful, not as ugly as human rights, but pretty bad. There's some guy who went on CBC Radio on the morning show, claimed to be a traditional First Nation person. That's how they interviewed him. Said, well, when we were young, we used to go into the dens and get the babies and collect a $25 bounty or something on each tail we bought into the government. And the next,
I've heard this.
And
I've heard that.
Yeah, and the next day, Lang, or one of the, maybe Doug Phillips, I don't know me, because he was a big hunting, fishing guy too, got up and said, in committee, the whole, well, Mr. Speaker, surely you agree with this. Well, actually a member for Tatch and Campbell, and not Mr. Speaker, because when you're in committee of the whole, you're a member of the writing. And I still remember Sam getting up and saying, I don't remember the exact words, but it was something like, in our culture, we do not kill the young of any species, and certainly never, ever for money. And there's a whole philosophy just built into that. Simple statement. And of course, how can you not listen to somebody do that? And there's a reconciliation thing. I'm going to tell you this story because it is actually kind of funny. Art Webster, who was not in cabinet most of the time until he became Minister of Environment after Porter left, but he was Deputy Speaker. And so he and Sam used to go to conferences, speakers' conferences every year together. And there was this very funny thing that Art did, which is, I still think was glorious. Sam, when he'd give at these conferences, he'd always give a speech in Tlingit. The fact that nobody else in the room could understand a word is kind of funny in a way, because it's kind of, he's giving this thing. So one of these things, Sam got up and gave a speech in Tlingit, and Art jumped up and said, well, excuse me, I'm Deputy Speaker in the Yukon, and one of my jobs is to interpret for Mr. Speaker Johnson. He then proceeded to explain everything that Speaker Johnson said. Of course, he didn't understand a friggin' word that Sam said. But the whole crowd was so impressed.
Yeah.
This white guy actually understood Tlingit. And he's explaining to, he knew enough about Sam's values and having worked with him as their speaker to actually do something that Sam might have said. But it was just, when I heard the story, because we weren't there, it was at the speakers' conference, I thought, that's actually like a moment of reconciliation, which is actually quite wonderful. It would have been better if he did speak Tlingit, but it was still something which said, I'm honoring this guy and what he does, and trying to show that I understand something of what he says.
Yeah, and being somebody who gets to go to communities, and I'm in Vuntut and Old Crow, and you have Brandon Keikovic, who can speak his language, and so he'll have one of his elders speak traditionally, and he'll interpret her in real time. And I would say there's nothing more powerful than witnessing that, and that type of representation and authenticity. And from a youth from that same community being able to interpret live to somebody who's an elder in the same culture, in that authentic way I've never witnessed anything as powerful.
But it is one of the things we should be investing in. But the last president of the university once, and I can't remember who her vice president was, doesn't matter, said to me, well, I heard, Mr. Penikett, you are skeptical about whether the university is the right place to learn Indigenous languages. I wasn't making a harsh criticism. I said, the reality is, in Latin America, but also in North America, universities have been one of the great agents of colonization and of ridding Indigenous people of their cultures and their languages. Because what did the Spanish do when they get it? When they found a bright young man, it was usually a young man, they would put him in some kind of priest's robe or some kind of training thing, and he would learn Spanish, and he would preach the gospel to his own people. But there's been a whole new thing of scholarship which has emerged, which is quite wonderful. There's a bunch of women scholars in the United States who've learned Nuatal and those languages, have gone back and realized that some of these guys went home at night and wrote in their own books, in their own language, what actually happened that day, not what the official reports said. And these women are now digging these things up and actually exposing the two views of the same event,
right?
Which is really kind of wonderful. I think it's a pity that Indigenous languages are in the shape they're in the Yukon. I don't know if the First Nation School Board is going to be the solution.
Well, the Yukon Native Language Center
is still there, but
is part of it.
Several people, but
CYFN, Yukon, the Yukon First Nation School Board,
right?
Yukon First Nation Education Directorate. That these all integrate into.
These are all the things, but we need to, at some point, to be honest enough, we want to assess the success or the viability of each of these things. I remember who started the Yukon Language Center, which was John Ritter, a guy from Boston who actually learned Tlingit No, he didn't learn Tlingit. He learned Gwich'in in one winter.
Isn't he one of the people that learned several?
Yes. No, he speaks many of them. He doesn't fluently, but he knows the languages. He knows the background. And I mean, I had a long discussion with him about Lewis people, which is Scotty Creek dialect of Upper Canada.
Yeah.
So, which is your bride's language too. That's which right. Is that anyway. So, but it's a very anyway. The point that Ritter was because he's a that is his field. That's his area of study of the language thing, and he learned it quickly. The fact when, as he put it to me, some First Nation people who didn't speak their language decided to take over the language center was actually a problem for him. It's not that he was worried about losing a job. I mean, he survived. Actually, I think his family has money, but So he's been able to stay here for a long time. But it's a pity that you take a talent like that and you say, why can't we work with him? Take his skills that he has as a linguist and help us, develop dictionaries. And, there's some of that stuff that's been done, but a dictionary alone won't save a language because you've got to have people using it,
Yeah.
And
there's pockets of success.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, by and large, languages are dying.
In my family, look who the one person who's interested in learning Apatana is, little Cheryl.
Right. Well, that's great.
She's an astonishing kid in all sorts of ways.
Yeah.
Did you hear about her last soccer tournament?
No.
She's in grade 2.
Yeah.
She plays with a bunch of grade 6 girls. I don't know how many teams, a regional tournament. She scored 21 goals.
Okay, that's ridiculous.
I mean, she's just astonishing.
That's like Wayne Gretzky.
Yeah, but I don't know whether she's Wayne Gretzky. And I worry that she'll become a teenager and lose interest in the game.
Well, then you need to advance them quickly.
Yeah. But anyway, I just think the kids are always surprising.
Yeah.
And anyway, not to get off of it, but I think for me, if we're thinking outside the legislature, outside of the Development Corporation, which I think I mentioned was created by the Energy Corporation, not the other way around.
Well, let's because I get the sense that I don't want to take too much time. I know this is an exhausting platform, to have these interviews. So I do want to cover that.
Yeah.
So so we started talking about we started talking about devolution, Yukon 2000 process, what the Yukon looked like, at that time, the purpose of the final agreements, and so it would be nice if you could comment on, what the Yukon looked like, why there was a need for certainty around resources and land development and industry through the final agreements, and what some of these mechanisms that came out of that process vis-a-vis the Yukon Development Corp and some of these kind of institutions that are still there and still prominent and may look a little different and act a little differently now. But that would be probably a nice way to end.
Let's just talk about energy for a second, because going back to the debates around that one body of water near Haines Junction, which AIIS Lake, which Yukon Energy Corporation kept wanting to raise, and the First Nations didn't want to raise. And eventually, some compromise was reached, but it took many years.
Yeah, their water relicensing is concluded, and it was a big deal.
But what happened? I'll tell you the story. I've actually published this in a book, so I don't. If I don't repeat myself accurately, I don't care. So. Eric Nielsen, who was RMP for 30 years, got to know me, and he could be harsh in his attacks, but he also kind of respected it. Like him, I actually had a brain. So a couple of times we had some really serious conversation. And one of the things, in his 30-year career, there would be one term when he was an MP when he'd hardly ever go to Ottawa because the Liberals were auditing his tax returns and he had to work as a lawyer to actually pay his tax bills. And then there would be a Tory government come in and he'd go there and spend time because he was actually a senior person in the caucus. So this is a picture that nobody else has really looked at very much, or not anymore. So when he would turn up when there was a Liberal power in Ottawa, and I would see in the West Wing, I sometimes went to the West Wing cafeteria to have breakfast with other MPs than a usual crowd in the Centre Block where my office was. And there was a lot of chat about Eric, why is he never going to Ottawa, what's he doing, blah, 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 blah. So I jokingly said to him, he turned up in West Block, and I said, "Oh, Eric, good to see you." I said, What brings you to Ottawa? I mean, he's the freaking MP. I shouldn't say things like that. He says, because he feeds right into it, because he's smart enough that he said, as you know, I'm the lawyer for Yukon Energy Corporation and for Southern ATCO and Southern, the parent company of that chain is. He said, I've got a court case at the Supreme Court. I'm representing them. So he's just genning me up,
Yeah.
That was actually funny, and we'd have joshing about that kind of thing over time. And then one day, when I'm not long after I'm Premier, he comes to my office and he said, I don't think he began this way, but anyway, I knew that he'd been the lawyer for ATCO and Southern Cap. What was it called? Something Southern. It was it had a name. Anyway, it was the parent company for Yukon Energy Corporation, which had been started by Willard Firth's grandfather, by the way, but bought out by ATCO at some point.
Yeah.
So he's coming to see me in my office. This is the Deputy Prime Minister.
Eric was.
Eric was. That's right.
Oh, wow.
Coming to see me in my office in Whitehorse. He said, I have something to talk to you about. I need to talk to you about. He said, I'm thinking about privatizing at Northern Canada Power Commission. How would you feel about that? I said, well, Eric, I think you know the answer to that. It's the NDP is a party that's always supported public utilities, something where a natural monopoly should be owned by the people, not by some company from outside somewhere else. And the colonial history of doing that is awful everywhere in the world. And he said, and he goes on and he's making this pitch for Ron Southern, who's the chairman of the board of that company. And he makes the pitch, and I say, I'm not going to support them. And he goes on, he starts giving various kind of arguments about this thing. And then I said, there's a moment of silence. And I look him in the eye and I say, Eric, I support public ownership. You want private ownership. Can you live with public ownership and private management? He knew instantly what I was talking about, which is the honest fact that we didn't have anybody in the Yukon government who could run a power corporation.
Right.
But ATCO, Southern's company, had the skills probably to manage, not to run, not to own, but to manage. And in an instant, this guy was no fool. He said, yes, I can live with that. That was the deal. A few seconds. Took a long time to put it on paper, but it was my way of protecting the Energy Corporation or NCPC's Yukon assets as a public property, as something. Now, the great failure in that, it's my failure as much as anybody, but I didn't get to be with it for very long, is the failure is in fact doing anything about supply, serious supply. Now, the truth is, and I...
Because most of those generational assets happened before,
yes,
right? The Whitehorse Hydro.
All of them.
Except with the exception of Mayo B.
Yeah, except for that. But they hadn't really taken... We were growing, we weren't doing anything about it. So I'd actually said, I don't know whose idea this was, it may have been Kepke's, but Kepke, I put Dave Joe and Kepke on the board from the beginning and made Dave Joe the chair.
Of the
Energy Corporation.
Yukon Energy Corporation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very public message about what we were doing and why we were doing it. And then we put some other people who were good Yukoners. Tim I put on probably as much, not because he was the federal land claims negotiator, because he was an engineer. But it was also useful. So at some point, when we're about to take it over, we got a plane, I can't remember if it was a plane or a helicopter, and we, three of us, flew over every potential hydro site in the Yukon.
Oh, potential.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I got Dave and the federal guy to agree that we take them off the board as potential land claims selections in the public interest. Mm-hmm. But I'm signaling that we're not hostile to the First Nations. The chair of the board is now this very smart young lawyer. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right? And so I got agreement on that. But it took me a few years to realize that the problem with that was there was nothing wrong with that decision, but none of those sites was close enough to the grid to be useful.
Right.
And it took me. I didn't know enough. I was too dumb, too stupid, didn't know enough about energy to know that. And so we're in the crisis that we are now in terms of supply crisis. And a few weeks of 40 below will really demonstrate how serious that problem is.
This Christmas was very brutal.
Yeah. Now, there are things that have been done, the batteries, the windmills, the things like that, but then none of
the renting of diesel generators.
Yeah, none of that.
LNG plants.
Yeah, none of that's sufficient. You know more about this than I do.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, we went ahead, we created the corporation, we got it going, and I assumed that after I got defeated that somebody would seriously take the question of supply. And in fact, to their credit, I'm trying to think who it was who was the guy who was the chair of the board for most of the time you were on the board. Not the chair of the board, the president of.
There was Andrew Hall, but before that was Dave Morrison.
Just Dave Morrison's local. So just think of Andrew Hall, because to his credit, I was now in opposition. I wasn't even in the legislature. Before he took the job, he came to see me in Vancouver. We sat down and we had breakfast. And I told him what I knew, because among the things I had to tell him were the story that followed after we bought it. We had the law, we had the transfer. Ron Southern never gave up trying to take over it. And Willard, because it was his family's, his uncle's or grandfather's family business too, never gave up. He gave up eventually, but he kept trying. He tried to do a deal with First Nations to privatize it.
Are you talking about the privatization of Yukon Energy still?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. When they wanted to do it, right?
Right.
So my part of this, while I'm still premier, I get summoned, and this wasn't an invite. I was summoned to Calgary by Ron Southern. Take me out one-on-one to dinner at the Petroleum Club. And this is at a time when oil prices were down. Like, there were more waiters in tuxedos at this place than there were. We were the only two people in this room. And I don't want to say this publicly, but maybe you can delete this, but I suspected that he didn't know, he wasn't a drinker for whatever reason. But he handed me a goldfish bowl of brandy.
Okay.
But he was an old man, as I am now, and going to the bathroom a lot. So he'd get up and go to the bathroom a lot. Each time in the bathroom, there's a rubber plant next to me. I'd dump the brandy into the rubber plant. And then he'd come back and give me another brandy bowl. Okay. And he just relentless pushing about what a good thing it would be for us to sell it to a company that really knows what it's doing. And some of those arguments may be good, but it wouldn't have been in the public interest of Yukon.
Yeah.
So we ended up having a standoff. I said no. And every time I went to the washroom, I dumped the brandy. And this poor rubber plant by the end of the evening was just limping like this. But I don't think he ever gave up, because I think the ATCO as the manager ended up, I remember having this problem with the condo board who didn't understand the arrangements you made, were saying, oh, you should never have agreed to that. Well, if we hadn't agreed to that, we would never have gotten Yukon Energy Corporation. That's simply what Eric could have said, I'm privatizing. It was at the end of his career anyway, and the deal was a compromise, but it was one that actually I thought was potentially an honorable compromise. We probably should have time limited it or something, but we didn't. Anyway, I think that we Yukoners, I'm not talking about individuals, we made a mistake in terms of not doing something about supply more major earlier than we have now. Because people are running around with small hydro projects. Our buddy in Carmack's talking about geothermal. There's all sorts of ideas up in there, but none of them are buying themselves. And I happen to know, because they told me, someone at BC Hydro told me this conversation is going on about line extension, which would probably cost billions to connect to.
Estimated at $4 billion, but it could definitely go higher.
Site C.
Oh, right. Sorry, Site C.
To connect to Site C,
Yeah. The Site C was estimated at like $2 to $3 billion.
Yeah, right.
And it ended up being like 15, 20.
Whatever it is, right? Yeah. So, and there's an argument going on in BC about whether BC is sending more power to California, while California is sending more back to BC. But anyway, it's a serious problem. And I'm not part of those discussions, but I told you I got invited to the board of, I guess it was the Development Corporation. And they were wrestling, and none of the people I knew, because none of them were around in the Yukon when I was here, were talking about what direction they could give to the Energy Corporation. And I said,
and you're talking about Yukon Development Corp.
Yeah.
Being the prime shareholder of Yukon Energy Corp.
But I said to explain to them, none of you here seem to understand that the Energy Corporation existed before the Development Corporation.
Right.
Well, why did you create the Development Corporation the same? I said, we created it with the same people on the same board for a reason. The reason is we could not, in good terms of good governance, you could not have a regulated utility owning a sawmill in Watson Lake. We created the Development Corporation because Casca wanted the sawmill in Watson Lake kept alive for perfectly good reasons. And we had boards, and we had good boards, and we had one manager who cut lots of lumber, and we had another manager who couldn't sell it. You know, the two things you have to do if you're running a business, right? Mm-hmm. You have to have product, and you have to be able to sell it. And so we did it as a kind of artificial thing. We didn't intend it to be the parent company in the normal sense of the Energy Corp. We just actually created it as a separate entity, Development Corporation. When there are lots of them, every province has them, every jurisdiction has them. But we didn't actually want it to run the Energy Corporation. But we made the board same. But we said to that board early on, you have different roles, completely different roles. And we didn't know if the sawmill survived, and it didn't. There was a moment when Judy Joe wanted to buy it, and I probably should have said yes, but...
Oh, the Yukon Development Corp?
Yeah.
To buy it?
Yeah. Well, not the Development Corporation, the First Nation Development Corporation. Mm-hmm. And I think, no disrespect to Judy, but she probably couldn't have run a sawmill very well.
So it was a development entity that... So at that time, it wasn't building critical Yukon infrastructure. It was kind of a mechanism to support Yukon development.
Well, it was a master crown. So if we wanted to get into other things, as many provinces do, of, I don't know, some specialized timber industry or some other thing which would be appropriate for a crown corporation. So non-profit making enterprises that were in the public interest, but certainly not the power company. I mean, that was the thing. I don't think anybody at the table knew that it had not been created as the parent of the Energy Corporation.
Right.
It was a fiction.
Yeah.
That was convenient for us, and we could do it without very complicated legislative maneuvers. And that bothered me because I thought, if people don't even know the history of the Energy Corporation and the Development Corporation, they're almost inevitably bound to make some bad decisions about what the two should be doing together.
And and it struggled over time. Like I've done a bit of a history analysis of it.
Yeah.
That it got into all kinds of weird things, like waste to, like an oil to energy. It's had its struggles, and over time they've done orders and councils to start to focus it.
Yeah.
And now it's very focused that it can't do anything unless it's energy related. At one point it was electricity related.
Yeah.
And I was part of the mechanism of, I was senior advisor Yukon Development Corp, and I worked with the minister at the time to create a new.
Who was that minister?
This was after Scott Kent. It was probably, I forget now. It was probably Ranj Pillai.
Okay. Okay.
If my memory serves.
Yeah.
Anyway, so there was an order in council that expanded it from electricity only to energy.
Yeah.
And the reason being is that because the utility is under such tremendous strain and there's so much electrification of heating in Whitehorse specifically, that if we could take the electric load off in through renewable heat. And in my community in Teslin, we have a wood chip biomass.
Which you developed, right?
I was part of it. I mean, I can't take full credit, but I'm definitely somebody who who championed it and supported it through my role as a executive council member, and I'm certainly continuing to champion biomass by and large across Canada and mentor other projects, but. So Yukon Development Corp has really kind of become focused, and at one point, Premier Pezlowski was pushing this legacy hydro project. So opening up that and the Yukon Party government at that point was visionary and saying we need new generational assets, and they created the LNG, and at one point it was touted as this emergency backup, and then we found out, well, it can't be an emergency backup, it can be base load. And so they've been grappling that for a while.
Yeah.
And Yukon Development Corp was promoting these legacy hydro projects. But without, and I think that problem that you identified, flying it and seeing, well, these aren't useful because of how far they're from the grid, that was left out of the conversation. They were pushing this major 300 megawatt in this area. And but there was no conversation about, and they kept saying the levelized cost of energy is the lowest, and that's a metric to kind of determine what is a more feasible, viable version renewable energy project to another. They left out transmission line connection, which, if the metric there is close to is close to $1 million per kilometer.
Yeah.
So I mean that changes the economics instantly.
BC had allowed a whole bunch of hustlers to go around and sell run-of-river projects to First Nations all over BC. And then the First Nations discovered afterwards they were nowhere close to the grid. And
right, yeah. But with that said, I'm a big fan of the ruralization.
As long as you're clear, that's what it's for.
This decentralized asset base and creating renewable energy in communities. When you start adding these on, it really starts right now. And you really noticed it this Christmas, looking at art, because they got Yukon Energy has this really great data sheet that shows you what we're consuming, which area, is it being heat? Is it thermal generated? Is it from the wind? Is it from the solar? And you can see the load that the hydro is carrying, but you see the load that diesel's carrying, and wind and solar are very minimal. To Kwalin Dunn's benefit, they really upped our wind turbine capacity, but it's such a drop in the bucket still. And solar, it's not producing when you need it the most, and there's so much summer solar, but there's so much surplus hydro in the summer. Right. They're spilling hydro to bring in solar. So I think with all that said, there is solutions out there. Geothermal could be part of it. I was touring Iceland. Their
geothermal is much closer to the surface.
It is, but we've had delegations here and said we have thermal. We have the geothermal. It's just a matter of accessing it. And
our friend from CarMax is passionate about
it. I think and so that company is now looking elsewhere right now as well. And that's kind of a futuristic technology. I'm not super big on that, but I think traditional geothermal, there is huge applicability there. The holy grail is electricity from geothermal. That's a tough nut. But definitely district heating solutions from geothermal is definitely possible. Communities taking on biomass that we're endowed with wood resource that is not being well utilized. And in some communities there are, and I'm working with some communities that are getting better at it and trying to create economies around this, that's an exciting proposition. But it's all these things that start to add up to allow a more stable, but so going back to Yukon Development Corp, that they were really pushing forward on this legacy hydro. And I think kind of fumbled I wouldn't say they're at the finish line, but they fumbled in the process. And a lot of the First Nations really kind of opposed it. So like in my community, which I have a better context of, we have a resolution that says there will never be a legacy hydro project, in our Teslin-Clickett traditional territory.
What did Kozlowski mean by a legacy project?
That was just the branding of it. They were just saying, that it's going to be a legacy.
Right.
And so that was in the name. That it's a legacy hydro project, that it's not just for here now, it's forever.
Right. Okay.
Right. And we benefit, so when I graduated out of school in 2012, that 2008, 2012, we were in a surplus, right, with the mines coming off. And then it must have been before your time, but when they were building all the hydro capacity to meet the Faro demand, and all of a sudden Faro came off, we lived in a surplus environment for a very long time.
Yep.
And then Dave Morrison tried to get ahead of the curve and build Mayo B. But that only added, a fairly small amount, but it's a critical amount, but only a small amount in the grand scheme. And so, even though we're at 128 theoretical capacity load, like Minister Laking, actually, he kind of characterized it as that's theoretical. That's if all the water's flowing, no problem. That's if all the wind's blowing. That's if all the solar, and that, all the generators are working 100%. It's more like 110, 108 is kind of our critical capacity.
Here's a quiz question for you. Do you know where the first hydroelectric project in Western Canada was?
Dawson?
Yeah. during the gold rush.
I
Well, do you know why I know? Because my father's cabin was right after on the North Fork of the Klondike.
Yeah.
Where a wooden dam across the river was actually holding back the water. And in fact,
somebody told me that there's like a 100-year-old old hydro site in Dawson, and I couldn't believe it.
Well, 1 year, that wooden dam finally fell apart.
Okay.
And the next year when I went fishing, because I always went fishing for getting there, because you could get one every cast.
Yeah.
Suddenly it's full of salmon.
Oh, wow.
I mean, I don't know how the hell that works. You don't get to travel a river for decades, and then suddenly you're back.
So, and that brings me to a big point is that, so I come from Indigenous Clean Energy. It's got the unfortunate acronym of AIIS right now, which is not quite a hot term in the world. But so Indigenous Clean Energy, fantastic program. It's building energy champions from Indigenous representatives across Canada. I was in the second cohort. One of my colleagues, Ed Genova, shout out to Ed Genova. He's the vice president of the New Brunswick utility. And he was a mentor of mine. And he gave me goosebumps once. And he said, Blair, what if we're able to revitalize and restore our rivers for salmon through nuclear power? And, and it gave me goosebumps because we look at what we've sacrificed for stable energy. And, we talk about hydro being clean and it is, it's clean and it's needed and it's core and critical part of our energy ecosystem. But there is a cost, and you just mentioned it, when these dams, and so Whitehorse Dam is the longest fish ladder in the world. That's both cool and sad at the same time.
Well, it probably doesn't work very well.
That's what I'm saying. They counted fish through it, and it was like, in the triple digits. So, and we've had fish stock, salmon stock, that were so plentiful that you could walk across streams. You could walk, it's just chock full.
Well, I hear stories like that about the mouth of the Yukon River in Alaska, right?
Yeah. But that was the headwaters too.
Yeah.
And my community and other communities, what is a fish camp? We don't even know what a fish camp is. I grew up in that context a little bit. My father and grandmother and stuff, that was their whole reality. My stepmom, she grew up in fish camp. That was her whole life. Like that, that was our lives and our livelihood to a large degree. Now the embarrassing story is we fly our fish in from Atlin, from the fisheries that they have access there. So our fish get flown in, and then we're able to kind of have this cultural practice. But that's large in part, not exclusively. There's all kinds of contributing factors to the decline and decimation of our salmon stock. But, like just pretend, what if we could restore, revitalize our rivers through the inclusion of small modular reactors? I don't want to get in trouble, but I think that is an interesting concept.
Well, I do think a larger discussion with more actors, more players. I know a guy who was actually not talking about run a river, small things, but actually something which you're using the same kind of technology, but not on river bottoms, but hanging onto bridges and so forth, can actually generate a local source of power for small communities.
Right.
So for village scale.
Yeah.
The interesting thing is this is how fast things can change. When I was a young man, late 60s in Dawson City, there was a fish wheel there, traditional fish wheel there, that had little Japanese guys sitting on the dock, buying this roe every day and flying it all the way to Tokyo. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's gone, right?
Yeah.
People don't even remember that, but that was there. That was a real part of it.
Yeah. So that gets exciting, and so maybe as a kind of a conclusion to this, and I really appreciate all of your time and energy and your history here. So talking about Yukon Development Corp, talking about our energy sector, and you kind of alluded to it a bit. So there is conversation about the Indigenous equity participation in the Connector project. And, and I'm part of the Yukon Conversation Chamber of Commerce. I chair a table of all the Indigenous wealth entities both their development corps and their trusts to look at collective investment opportunities. And one of the big ones is the connector project. There's other conversations out there about Northwest Tel being sold to Indigenous groups. Majority.
Well, I thought that had gone through.
No, it's
pending, is it?
It's been in the works, you know, and I think it needs.
Before you go off to telephone, I want to tell you that I have been invited onto the board of something called PowerTech.
Okay.
Do you know what that is?
No.
This is the R&D subsidiary of BC Hydro.
Okay.
I overheard a conversation about someone talking about Hydro about coming up and trying to do something to help the Yukon with the energy deficit there.
Okay.
I don't know what that's about because I wasn't part of the conversation.
Yeah.
But what PowerTech is doing is really interesting stuff with hydrogen. I mean, they're looking at a whole range of stuff. And these are serious scientists. I mean, sometime when you come to Vancouver, I'll take you out there because if I'm going to be on the board, I can do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
They've got places that look like science fiction rooms of all this incredible kind of machinery. I don't even know what it does, but as a photograph, it looks wonderful.
Yeah.
Very interesting. And there's some really smart people on that board.
Yeah.
I don't know where it'll go, but that's where I overheard the conversation about BC Hydro was trying to do something. This is before the recent change of government, to do something about either extending hydro line, which we know costs billions, or doing something else. I don't know what.
Well, that is in movement, you know, and so the Yukon Development Corp is taking that on. So Gary Gazanskis, who's now the new president of Yukon Development Corp, is taking the charge of that, and the Prime Minister of Canada is aware of it, and they're moving it forward as a major project.
Oh, good.
So I don't think it's got that. It's not part of that major project.
But it's a very expensive project.
It is, and will become a net buyer. But what it effectively does is it stabilizes our grid. It allows renewable energy projects that may not have been viable before to have a year-round client base, which wasn't the case before.
Right.
And it allows all of those renewable energy projects along its corridor become viable. In my community, we have like a long list of all of these. Would be nice if there was a local transmission line, now become viable because there's going to be a local transmission line. But and just to finish this concluding thought is that there is already talks. I'm not at that table, but there's talks with ATCO on spinning off an asset load into an Indigenous ownership model. And I don't think it's everything, but it's a bunch. And then possible, and I don't think it's at a table yet, but the whole privatization it doesn't disappear. The privatization of our utility into an Indigenous ownership model. And maybe that's a good, concluding thought for you. And I've heard where you just said that doesn't work and you need to be cautious.
Well, I would do it. If I were going to do that, go down that road, I would want to make sure that it's actually a co-ownership with as long as there's a non-Indigenous majority in the territory, their worry is going to be the competence of the management of a utility.
Right, and the same argument could be said for the Northwest Tel deal. Where I mean, like, as an investor, and I represent investors within the Yukon, I worry about investing in any business that I don't have within my sphere of influence the management capability to manage. But with that said, there's a lot of competent management people and teams and companies to partner with so that that can be a mitigated risk.
If you're going to do something really interesting, intriguing, different, and dangerous, you got to spend some time talking about it with a larger group than your initial little team, right?
Sure.
You got to you got to
open the barn gates.
Yeah, bring the people in to have a. Because when it comes to energy things, there's a lot of stuff I don't agree with Tim on, but I felt he was the right guy to be on the board because he was an engineer, one, and two, even when he was disagreeing, he wasn't being disagreeable. He was basically saying, well, you got to think about this too, which you need.
Yeah. So the things that we didn't cover, and maybe there'll be a part 2 eventually, is everything that has got to do with Chapter 22. We started talking, we teased some things about the strategic investment opportunities. You talked about,
which, by the way, connects to the Council on the Economy and the Environment.
yes. Yeah. Well, that was a body that was kind of this multi-party kind of steering advisory group, or was it a decision body?
It was really intended to facilitate dialogue between these sectors of the economy.
Yeah.
The danger in the Yukon is when you've got such a huge bureaucracy relative to the size of the population, is there's too many bureaucrats making decisions which they're not competent to make. I don't mean that in a mean way. They're a bad engineer, bad educator. If they were hired from Ontario or Quebec, there's a whole bunch of history they don't know.
Yeah. We didn't really, I mean, we started talking about the representation in the public sector, in the government. That's part of Chapter 22. And I think maybe this is an opportunity to kind of put a plug out there that we hosted, and you and I, but you were our personality, think tanks on Chapter 22, where we partnered with 40 at -40, a group that you're part of that is all about.
That was actually a pretty good discussion when I think about it.
Fantastic. It was fantastic. Well, I actually have colleagues who said, I wanted to learn more about Chapter 22, so I Googled it and I found these excellent videos. And I found out that you produced them. And so you and myself with Gunta Business working with CYFN, and we partnered with CYFN that was the 40 at -40, which is its own group of those who were part of the original negotiation. Just wanting to educate, create a cross educational platform of the spirit and intent of the final agreements, and kind of make it part of core curriculum. Right. That's kind of the understanding there. So we held a think tank on Chapter 22. And you, through all your connections, you brought in a lot of the original negotiators and a lot of the representation of each component of Chapter 22, and that was the best session that we had. We also we partnered with Yukon First Nation Culture and Tourism, and we met with some cultural tourism, cultural celebration advocates that were all about the revitalization of the traditional economy. That one is how we ended it, which was fantastic.
This is the thing about the Lindsay Staples research and the country food thing, because you can't talk about unless you're actually going to find a way to assess it, calculate it, measure it. Because that's important.
Just that quantification of the traditional economy. To a degree, what has been lost from the contemporary economy.
Well, we lost it because we weren't counting it.
Right. Yeah, and that's such important. What we learned in the process of doing an assessment for Chapter 22 is you got to be able to quantify this. What's the baseline? What is that contributed value? How does that differ from?
I think Lindsay Staples may have said this line: if you don't count it, you can't count on it.
That's right. That's good. And then just to round this out, we partnered with the Yukon First Nation Chamber of Commerce to create a think tank on Indigenous business partnership with industry, and we had kind of the good, the bad, the ugly. What was the learnings? And we had some excellent conversations there.
And the big danger is always the vulnerability of minorities or minor shareholders, as you know, minor partners.
Yes. And then we had a great session on community development and capacity development. And that was partnered with Gunta. So I was able to pull in some of the Teslan representatives that were able to talk about kind of the community development plan, restoring our economy, all that pre-planning and engagement work that built out this huge initiative of building capacity and creating local economy.
Right.
So anybody who's listening to this should definitely check that out. And I think, we could keep going on this, but I think this would be
Well, I'm happy to continue the discussion. One thing I wouldn't mind doing, though, before you publish in any sense, is because I'm conscious of telling stories that I don't know that I haven't fact-checked in my mind. Do I remembering the right person, the right date, the right number, the right thing? Which is useful if you can double check it. So I can double check it, not you. I don't mean you to.
On that too. So I think there is a disclaimer that this is just a conversation, and that you or I could be wrong at things. I think there's an opportunity to kind of put little updates that kind of represent what is.
Yeah, you don't want crazy people accusing you of lying.
Yeah, no, I mean we're having a conversation in good faith.
Yeah.
And this is all about creating a platform of education and sharing of information. So, I think with that, I will thank you.
Okay.
On an excellent conversation, and what a great way to kick off this new platform. Okay, thank you.
Can I go to the bathroom?
Yes, you may.
I hope you didn't.